We better get on to the next speaker. Her name is Sepi Azarbaijani-Moghaddam. She is going to talk about the need for a viable, unified Iranian diasporas movement. She's published papers, she's done a lot of advising, and actually I should probably read her biography while she's online. So Sepi is actually in Italy at the moment, but she's living in Scotland. She's a PhD candidate at St Andrews University, and hopefully she'll be there.
Hi, Ferry.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Sei in Italia? Are you in Italy?
I am indeed in Italia. Okay.
So Sepi Azarbaijani-Moghaddam is an Iranian-born British national. She's an Oxford graduate, an international development consultant and social scientist with 28 years of experience in conflict and post-conflict settings, notably Afghanistan. She specializes in working with international and local governments and military actors, local leaders, civil society and communities. Her role as gender equality expert stems from her research as an academic focusing on women and armed groups in conflict and post-conflict areas. From the 1990s, Sepi worked on negotiating access from Afghanistan's Mujahideen and the Taliban forces so that the aid teams could work with women in the most closed communities, reducing the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence and harmful practices against women and girls. She worked extensively with Afghan civil society and local leaders for the period of the Taliban rule into the post-Taliban era and served as a senior analyst for Save the Children International. In 2007, she started researching civil-military relations and advised the British military command in southern Afghanistan as a regional expert. Since 2013, Sepi works on both security and civil society sectors of Afghanistan, and she's published books and papers and presented extensively on Afghanistan, and has also worked in Pakistan, Tajikistan, Rwanda, Somalia, Indonesia, and Kenya. She is currently a PhD candidate in international relations on pre-2001 Taliban identity at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Was that all correct?
It's all correct, except that now it's 30 years. 30 years experience. I'm getting older.
I don't want to age you. So
yeah,
everyone's very happy to hear from you. Please tell us what your thoughts are on the need for a viable, unified Iranian diaspora women's movement.
I mean, there is a need, but I'm just going to reflect, because for 30 years we've been trying to get a women's movement up and running in Afghanistan. It just hasn't been very easy. And, it's created a lot of problems for Afghan women. You can see what's happening with the Taliban. And the Taliban are just bullying the international community, and nobody can really say anything,
I was interested that in your bio it was talked about a post-Taliban era. When is the post-Taliban era?
It was 2001, when the Taliban collapsed and the Karzai regime eventually came in. So that was the post-Taliban era.
Mm. And now it's, what do they call this new era then?
They call it Taliban version 2, bizarrely. Some people call it Taliban version 2. And it's kind of, different names. But I think people are still sort of holding their breath and hoping that they'll go away. There's a lot of denial about the fact that the Taliban came back.
Where is the denial? In the European communities, in the overseas
No,
communities?
everywhere, even amongst the Afghan diaspora, they just think that they can somehow wish the Taliban away. But it's like the regime in Iran. You cannot wish these people away.
Yeah, so how can we, as Iranian activists, avoid that?
That's kind of what I'm going to touch on. I mean, it's a long, complicated and serious discussion, but it's what I'm going to touch on. I mean, it goes into the women, peace and security space that I'm very critical of. And in fact, yesterday, I was talking to a colleague and we were sort of thinking, is it time to sort of start critiquing that, especially UN pushed women, peace and security space, because it really hasn't gotten any results. So I think, so many things are being torn down and rebuilt. And I'm thinking that's one of the things that has to be torn down and rebuilt. The other thing is that, again, I'll touch on this in my talk very briefly. I think that Iranian women are such a unique category, such an anomaly. And we're such a unique category. And, you know, like we are not the same as, let's say, women in Somalia, women in Afghanistan or whatever. We're just not. We're just not like that. We just haven't had that history. We're not like that. The diaspora is not like that. We just haven't been, you know, like arriving as refugees. And we just, we came, a lot of us, diaspora came out in the 60s and 70s before the revolution even was, you know, a twinkle in Khomeini's eyes. And we built careers. You know, we are really thriving in a lot of different sectors. We are just like very impressive. We just didn't wait for somebody to come and give us a helping hand or a leg up or whatever. We just went for it, you know, and we just carved spaces for ourselves. And nobody acknowledged that, you know, oh, we need the voices of Iranian women to come out or whatever. But we were in the background helping a whole heap of other women, you know.
Okay, brilliant. That's good to hear, and thank you. So I'm going to sit down now, and I'm going to let you talk for a bit, and then I'll come back on, yeah?
Okay.
Okay, great.
So you've spoken about me, and you've introduced, you know, what I did and how I entered the sort of fields that I'm working in. And I think I do just want to talk a little bit, like we just discussed, Fari and I, the issue with Iranian women. And I just want to discuss a little bit my personal feelings about, you know, being part of the Iranian diaspora. I arrived in the UK when I was 7. And there was really, in those days, many things exist now that didn't exist in those days. They're really, you know, we didn't come in as a category of refugees. We didn't come in on a wave of, I don't know, war or revolution. Like many people did escape the revolution here and there. There were a large number of people who left the country just before the revolution and after the revolution. But we weren't treated, for instance, the same way as Afghan women are being treated today. We had to go to the countries we ended up in, and then we had to find our own way. Iranian mothers are really dragon mothers, you know. They really push their children to thrive and to do really well. And that's what we did. We just went ahead and we thrived. We did really well. We became very prominent in our various sectors. We became forces to be reckoned with. But we never had that sort of grouping of being united as an Iranian diaspora. I think some people did set up groups. I think the people in America have been much better about this, perhaps in other European countries as well that I don't know about. But certainly in the UK, you know, I was in Birmingham. We used to travel to London a lot to meet up with Iranians in London. There wasn't anything for Iranian women. And especially as I got older and went to university and then, you know, like started in my chosen career, there weren't really any groups or movements, etc., of Iranian women in the diaspora to sort of get together and talk about what it meant to be Iranian and what had happened to our identity. Because, you know, like a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now is an identity issue to a certain extent, like the national identity of Iranians. What was happening before the revolution, the whole secular aspects of it versus what happened after the revolution and the creation of this very conservative Islamic identity, which the regime has tried to push onto people. And then now the massive backlash that we're seeing in the women life freedom movement. So, you know, it's really interesting to think about that. And if I wanted to talk about the women's movement, I would start right there. I would say, you know, like the diaspora needs to get together and talk about their identity and what happened and the quiet sort of trauma that we suffered on our own because nobody was really talking about it. The press never really talked about it. It was never really featured. So all of us came out. We dealt with massive loss. A lot of us lost the country. People like me who came from the southwest of Iran, we lost our town in the Iran-Iraq war. We lost relatives. We lost memories. You know, like people don't think about that aspect of war when you, for instance, lose things like places where you had childhood memories, where you lose, for instance, graveyards. So you can no longer go and visit your grandfather's grave or your mother or father's grave. This is all horrendous loss. And we went through all of these losses on our own. At the same time as this was happening to us, of course, in Iran, communities like in the southwest, again, all of my relatives became displaced, that they had to go up to Tehran or other parts of Iran and find new lives, new identities. And, it was extremely disruptive. They went through all the trauma of the revolution, and we were going through different levels and different degrees of trauma separately. And nobody was really talking about it. Like the Iran-Iraq war didn't really feature, in the international media in the way that, for instance, wars are featured now, where they impact women and children. The women and children of that war, for instance, were completely invisible. So I think there's a lot to be discussed on that front. All those, difficulties that people went through inside and outside the country. Of course, for people inside, much worse. But there's been a lot, a lot has gone on. So moving on to the topic of just some very quick observations about women's movement and, what needs to be taken into consideration. And then, whoever wants to get deeper into some of the topics we can discuss. I think one of the issues which is already creating conflict with the situation in Iran is representation. All the different groups, all the different interests which exist, all the issues for the different groups, the grievances for the different groups, the outlooks of the different groups. And when I say different groups, I mean different socioeconomic, sociocultural, sociopolitical, different levels of religious conservatism, etc., etc. We don't have a viable representation. We have a very narrow representation of very specific, ideas. And I think that, the frustration that has exploded in Iran, it's not just about hair or women's hijab, it's about economic situation, which has been absolutely horrendous, about political repression, which has been ongoing for many years, and also the horrendous stuff which happened during COVID, which impacted a lot of families and traumatized the entire country, which nobody was allowed to talk about in many ways. So this has exploded once this issue happened with Mahsa Amini and everything kicked off. And it's taken, many different shapes, but there's a lot of grievance in Iran. It's not just the hijab thing. The other thing that's really important is, in my opinion, not allowing representations and leaders of movements to be funded from anywhere outside or by foreign countries. This happened in Afghanistan, and what happens then is that male leaderships can easily discount such people by calling them puppets of whoever is funding them, and also accusing them of being foreign, pushing foreign ideologies and so on and so forth. So it's very critical that if we want to have a viable movement, that it's self-funded, as in, people who are of Iranian origin, within the movement, and especially of women, to fund the movement. When men start funding women's movements, then there's usually an agenda. And really, I would very much like to see globally an era where women entrepreneurs are funding women's movements. And, this is within reach nowadays. There's a lot of work on this issue, and this is what I would like to see. I think that this is where we would actually have success. The other thing is, which ties into this, is we're in an era of decolonization. Now, people will tell you that Iran historically was never colonized. True, Afghanistan also was never colonized, but we were surrounded by countries which were colonized, and we were very much influenced, and we were very much, how to put it, there was a lot of corrosion of the powers of, like whichever elites were running the country, and we were quasi-colonized. And so as quasi-colonized countries, we also need to look at the whole issue of decolonization and make sure that we're not being colonized and we're holding to principles which have been decided by viable representatives within our own movements. So this is very important for movements to be Iranian and not to be colonized. So that's a whole other big discussion. Also, very important for me is watching, the way that women's leaders and leaders of movements, etc., have been manipulated and brought onto the international stage, taken off the international stage, and they're completely, in many ways, at the mercy of people who may or may not want to have them on the international stage for their own purposes at any point in time. They're dismissed when it's not, kind of feasible or of interest for the powers that be, and then brought in when it's interesting and feasible for the powers that be. Many people have written fantastic articles on how the women's issue was mobilized after September 11th, 2001 to put a human face on, the invasion of Afghanistan by coalition forces. But, when it came down to it, women's issues were not given the real priority place that they should have been given from that point onwards. And they were always a sideshow to what the international community was doing. And the result is what we see today, that, there is really no solid women's movement in Afghanistan, and that it has been very easy for the Taliban to dismiss women and to remove them from the public sphere. So in order for that not to happen, the people who are representing and working on this issue really need to understand very clearly where power is located, how to speak to that power, how to work with that power, and how to leverage different assets, etc., to influence that power. Because otherwise, we are just a gimmicky sideshow, which is, used by the media for as long as it's interesting and then discarded. So striking while the opportunity is there, striking while the iron is hot, and getting into those spaces to make a difference and to make substantive change. But as I said, that means that we have to be up on our game and, really represent groups in a viable way. I'm going to stop talking there, Faria, see if there's anyone who has any specific questions.
Would anyone like to ask Sepi to expound on anything that she touched on? You're welcome to come up here and talk to her directly on the screen. As we did yesterday with Dr. Pantea Karimi, who was talking to us from America. Hi, Matty, we're in here. I'll just see Matty. Come on. Anyone would like to ask a question? No? Okay, I've got one. So you discussed, and we're in an era of decolonization in Iran. That's a really interesting idea. I mean, we talk about, the oil sort of colonization. So how during Mossadegh's era, BP, British Petroleum had, which was then called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, they owned a city. They literally ran a city, as you could compare, I suppose, now in Saudi Arabia. What's that oil company?
Aramco,
yes. They have their own area, they have swimming, they have sea. They live as Westerners in the Aramco enclave within Saudi Arabia. But, in the 50s in Iran, it was literally, a British colony overseas, building dams and owning this city. And I think the comparison to colonization is very apt. with that in mind, and then later we could talk about the kind of colonization that happened in Iran, for the kind of idea of the West's influence, which then Khamenei used as a tool in his own campaign, which he called West toxification. So this idea of West toxification, having a dog or wearing jeans or anything like that, being influenced by the demon West, was a kind of a backlash against the speedy modernization programs that happened under the Shah, which people, in part wanted, but I think was also difficult to deal with at such a speed. So when you talk about we're in an era of decolonization, what particular things are you looking or thinking of when you say that? Are you thinking about self-awareness in art? Are you talking about discourse in, online groups? Or
we're seeing it. We're seeing it in academia. We're seeing it in. It's kind of creeping into journalism, and it's definitely, obviously becoming a big issue in the aid and assistance world. Moving away from the era of the white savior. And the examples you gave from Iran are excellent examples. And I think that, Iranian identity is definitely very rich, very complex. And, we had extremely westernized elites, no going backwards on that. But, I think, again, like if you look at Kabul, we often talk about the Kabul in Afghanistan. And the focus is on the westernized elites. And it seems like the whole of Afghanistan is just those westernized elites. And we talk about them all the time. We don't talk about all the other identities and all the other layers of Afghan society that exist beyond the confines of Kabul, where a small group of people could speak English and interact with the foreigners. And those are the groups who, because they can speak English, influence the media and so on and so forth. Now, in Iran, thankfully, the level of education was extremely high, literacy, etc., and a lot of people are English speakers, so we don't necessarily have that problem. But still, we don't very often, for instance, hear people going and talking to the poorest sectors of Iranian society. Like when I look all the way from the UK, sitting comfortably in my house and not being able to support these brave people who are out fighting the regime. But quite often the videos and stuff, when I observe very carefully, these people are sitting quite often in nice cars. They've got nice clothes, and they seem to be the ones who are pushing. And I'm thinking, okay, so is this a sort of socioeconomic grouping, specific grouping that we're seeing that are dominating somehow?
I think I can answer that.
Who is represented?
I think I can answer that in part. I think it's the way you're seeing it is through certain platforms. So if you were to go on, say, Telegram and link up with local youth groups say in the Kurdish mountains or in the Balochi areas of resistance, you will find on Telegram them speaking directly to you, and their videos aren't actually that dissimilar from the kids that live in cities who are a bit more economically strong, if you like. So yes, I think the voices. I don't hear disparity in what I see coming from the poorer areas or the areas where people are struggling, but except some of the issues. So, for example, there was a lot of issues about them not having fuel in some towns, even and there have been issues about them being targeted because they're on the Kurdish regions where they felt resistance was stronger. And so there is a different narrative coming out of them, but the same sense of strength and identity. But the white savior thing, I'm not sure how it really manifests. so it's quite
No,
complicated.
no.
Yeah.
Let me clarify here.
Yes.
So I spoke previously, and like, yes, I have watched the Kurdish videos, and yes, I very much watched the Baluchi stuff because I'm interested, because obviously it's right next door to Afghanistan. So those are very different issues. The Baluchis had problems, and the Kurds had problems, have had problems even from the time of the Shah. So this is like long-term conflict with the centralized authorities, which, are now manifesting under this particular authority. And this is what I was talking about when I was saying, this is not just about hijab. This also has to do with, minority identities, and the treatment of minorities by the Iranian government, which has not been great, because previous to this exploding, there were a lot of riots, etc., from Arabs in the southwest. So the Arab minority also has grievances, and like the Azeris in the north have also always had problems with central government. So these are bigger issues. The other thing is the economy. Like, there are people who have been close to starvation. But this is just not covered, and we're missing these aspects: the mismanagement of the economy and the oppression of minority groups. Of course, women within those groups are further oppressed. We all know that women who have, the discrimination of gender and also the discrimination according to their socioeconomic class suffer a great deal more. So this is, like what I was talking about previously. Sorry, and then you said something. Oh yes, really the white savior.
Yeah.
There is the white savior issue. How the white savior issue manifests here, which is really interesting, is that there is a certain protocol of how to handle women from so-called developed countries, or sort of countries with conservative regimes, which doesn't work for Iranians, because we're not coming from a hugely, a country with very underdeveloped infrastructure, high levels of non-literacy, etc., where people can kind of swoop in and behave in a certain way and wheel out certain projects. And I think because of that, there is a certain level of confusion on how exactly to interact with Iranian women. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about.
I think.
You talked about.
Sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned them being brought on and then dismissed from the international stage.
Afghans.
Oh, Afghans. Were you talking about Afghan women?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on then.
Yeah, and this might well happen with the Iran issue as well. Like, this might well happen because, people promise, like, sorry. Excuse me. Behind the scenes, people make all sorts of negotiations and promises, and like that they represent X, Y, and Z, and that they can mobilize certain groups of people for certain results that are of interest to governments outside Iran. And once those promises are not reached, and then those mobilizations, etc., don't occur, the impact is not had, then those people are quite readily dismissed. The other thing is that all of these various governments whose media is showing these protests are also in all sorts of negotiations behind the scenes with the Iranian government based on their foreign policy, both the overt stuff and the covert stuff.
Also, their oil and energy needs.
Energy, but geopolitical issues as well.
Oh yes.
There's also the whole issue of the nuclear stuff, and then the arms to Ukraine. There's also the influence of China and Russia. And so there's a lot of different things going on, plus Iran's role in funding proxy wars in the region. And, so interestingly, this new situation which China has concocted, where Saudi and Iran have entered into peace talks, is a massive game changer for the entire region. This is like a historic game changer. I cannot stress how important this is. And as a result of this, many factors globally, geopolitically, are going to shift. And this has implications on so many different levels, and I think we're not going to see what happens for a while. But for instance, on the surface thus far, what it's led to is possibly peace in Yemen, possibly some stabilization of the situation in Syria, and we're going to see a lot of other knock-on effects. What that means in terms of Western foreign policy in that region, what that means in terms of interest in women's rights movements and so on and so forth, remains to be seen.
Okay. I think we see.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and it'd be interesting if
Thank
you wrote.
you.
You should probably write an article if you can for The Economist or someone like that about what you think that deal is going to look like for Iran and the movement to be free of that the government. So we have a question from one question from the audience. And yourself and just.
Okay. Hi, my name is Lilian Patch. I'm a Brazilian journalist, and I'm doing a master here in curating. And having said that, there is not about the hijab, and we know that's not about the hijab. What's the difference between before the 1979 revolution, when the women were obliged to take off the hijab, and now that they are obliged to wear the hijab? And because both for me looks like a violence and a violence about the human rights, and also how art can address this issue, and from the Western point of view, and not being a colonized point of view.
It's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't have the answers because I don't deal with, the impact of art and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I'm at the gun end of things, so I could tell you. Sadly, I see that it's always the people who wield the weapons who have the power. The power of art. Yeah, I mean, it's important, and. Again, in Afghanistan, artists have tried to convey what's happening and so on and so forth. But, do they have the power to change anything? Will it lead to people's movements and so on and so forth? It's very, I don't think that it will have the impact that people think it will have. Psychologically, yes, it's great. It's an outlet, it's expression, it's creative. But, after all these years of working on these issues, and as a woman, and having expectations and hopes and so on and so forth, when I came into this, I've reached a stage where I sometimes wonder if it isn't just a case that women have to wage war themselves, sadly, in order to create the space that they need, where we are being forced to do stuff all the time. Exactly as you said, take off the hijab, put on the hijab, be afraid of the male gaze, work for the male gaze. There is just as much pressure I see in the West, for instance, to do so much for the male gaze. Just look at TikTok and you see the impact of the male gaze on so many young women. And for me, that's also a form of oppression, They're not allowed to express themselves, to express, what they embody in a healthy way. This is my opinion. And similarly, I just sort of see that on all sides there's extremism and there's oppression of women, and there is men doing business on women's bodies, and I find this very, very difficult to cope with. And it just gets heightened and much, much worse in situations of conflict and war, when women are trafficked, and when women have to effectively sell those bodies in order to survive, you know? So it's just a very grim situation. And, you know, with the hyperconnectivity that we have nowadays and the bombardment with information, it becomes even more difficult to sift through and come out with clarity to answer such questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much, Sepi, and I absolutely demand that you write that article soon about the what it will mean, this new deal that was brokered by China, in your own opinion. Would you do that for us?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Oh, well, it's going to go at the long list of other articles I have to write. And right now, you know, it's the whole UN and Afghanistan and the engagement with the Taliban on women's issues, which is like just sucking up all of my time, actually. Thank you very much, Ferry.
Please join me in thanking Sepi Azarbaijani-Moghaddam for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks.
And,
okay.
Bye.
I do everything on LinkedIn.
Okay,
so
well done.
If you want to see my thoughts and ideas and articles and presentations and podcasts, it's all on LinkedIn.
Good tip, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll speak again.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye,
bye-bye.
Sepi.